Good day, Black Knight scholars. It is Mr. Deegan. It's the VidNotes Zone D226 studio. I'm reporting live. Unit 6. Let's do it. Please write down your learning target. I will understand how European imperialism and colonialism affected Africa. We're going to be studying the continent of Africa this unit, and we're going to be studying how European leaders decided to go to Africa for opportunities that they saw. It had to do with power and money. Let's do it. First, where have we been and where are we going? Well, we have been in Europe for Unit 2, 3, and 4. We've been talking about different revolutions in Europe, revolutions involving religion, art, politics. We've also been to Latin America, where we've seen how that area of the world has been changed by Europe forever, for better and for worse. Cultures have changed. And in Africa, we're going to see how Europe changes this continent for better, for worse as well. Let's do it. African countries we will study. It's important to know where they are before we get into their stories. So please, on your blank map, draw a dot, an arrow, and then label each of these 8 countries on your sheet. Stop this video, press the spacebar, pause it, and do it now. Pause. Okay. On we go. Africa today, what's it like? Let's talk especially about sub-Saharan Africa. That's the area of Africa that is south of the Sahara Desert. So this green here. This is the most challenged region in the world. Why? They have the lowest life expectancies, the highest infant mortality rates, baby deaths, the lowest literacy rates, so low education, and the lowest GDPs in these countries. So the economies are the weakest. Why is that? Why does Africa face challenges today? Answer, its history of being exploited, taken advantage of. We're going to investigate that more deeply now. First, we go back to what we've already studied, the transatlantic slave trade, which took millions of people out of their villages, out of their homes in Africa, and brought them around the world, especially to South America, the Caribbean, and North America. So families were disrupted, generations were disrupted by this slave trade. Also, European countries claimed colonies, and this meeting is so important. The Berlin Conference in Berlin, Germany of 1884, it decides what European countries are going to claim what land in Africa as colonies. And you see on this map all of the areas in Africa and all of the European countries that claimed those areas. And it was decided in this room by these European men, and here's the picture of Africa. Who was absent? African leaders. They didn't have a voice in who was going to control their own lands. That is not right, and that is why Africa faces challenges today. Another reason is that African countries today are still young. They are under 70 years old. 70 for a country is a young age. So why does that make a challenge? Well, these countries lacked infrastructure at their independence. They lacked the basics for a society to function. And they're still lacking interstate systems like roads and bridges and highways and communication systems, telephone poles, and ways for people in these countries to communicate. They're still young, they're still growing. And a part of the history of Africa that we need to talk about is the history of imperialism and colonialism that Europe imposed on Africa. Let's talk about it. First, let's define this I word, imperialism. It's a country's plan to increase its power by taking over another country, and Europe did that in Africa. How did imperialism start? Well, it starts in Portugal with the trading of slaves in the 1400s. Here's a man we're familiar with, Prince Henry the Navigator. He hired sailors to find gold in Africa, and his sailors returned with captured Africans. And thus, it started the idea of having African slaves. There's the area of the land that Prince Henry's sailors explored. Imperialism also starts with the triangular trade routes of the 1500s. Africa trades its ivory, gold, and enslaved people in exchange for European manufactured goods that are being made in European factories. And this starts the Middle Passage in the transatlantic slave trade. And it also starts Europe really thinking of Africa in terms of money and resources. The Industrial Revolution in Europe in the 1700s also starts imperialism. Industrial nations in Europe needed raw materials and they needed markets to expand their economies. What did imperialism spread? Imperialism spread the economic, political, and social ideas of Europe around the world, in Africa, but also in Asia, and also in the Americas. Europe wants more power. They spread their wings, and they also spread their culture, their languages, their religions as well. Societies resist. Resistance to imperialism took many forms in Africa, including armed conflict and intellectual movements. So ideas and violence were mixed. And these are all colonies. These European countries claimed these lands as their own after 1884. What is a colony? Colonies are lands that an empire owns beyond its home. Here's Britain, that's its home, but it controlled all of these areas in pink at its height. They were all colonies of Britain in one way or another. So what's colonialism? It's collecting colonies to gain wealth and power. How did Europe take over? European economic, military, and political power forced colonized countries to trade on European terms. The Europeans drove the negotiations. They had the power, they had the control, so they got the deal that they wanted out of it. How did Europe take over? Manufactured goods were sold in Europe's colonies. This system took over the colony's traditional industries. So shirts were no longer made in Africa, they were made in England and then sold to countries in Africa. In a way, the African countries became dependent, reliant on European goods. They weren't making their own. It's like when you're reliant on a calculator for math, you can no longer do math in your own head because you're so reliant on a calculator. It's somewhat similar to what's going on with imperialism in Africa by Europe. And remember this M word, mercantilism? This was happening in Africa as well. You had the raw goods in Africa being brought to Europe, and they're being transformed into manufactured goods that are then being sold back to African countries. And who's making the money? The mother countries in Europe. This is mercantilism, and it applies to Africa as well. Well, we are almost done. Go back over your notes, find a research question that you'd like to ask to learn more about anything we have learned. And once you're done with that, you are done with 6-1. This is Mr. Deegan signing off.